I'm Leif Hamrick with Snow Creek. I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about sod and seed, prep and installation. Those are common things that you'll see in our landscape installs, and so it's important we understand all those components. The prep work for the two is pretty much the same as far as how you prep the ground, looking for slope, looking for low spots. All those things are going to be the exact same for sod or seed. I'll kind of start with sod first. One thing about sod, when it's coming to your job site, it'll most likely be on a pallet, a big large pallet, 500 square feet. If you're handling that with machinery, one of the main things you need to understand is that's extremely heavy. It's all about how you handle the sod, getting it off the truck, off the trailer, whatever it may be. Realize for your machine it's going to be quite a load. You want to get it as close to where you're going to work as possible without damaging existing turf or driveways or walkways. Sometimes you have to carry it a great distance. You just never know. So we'll start with some of the basics of the prep. So as you can see from this soil and this example site, it's relatively close to grade. Typically we say we inherit sites within an inch of grade, but as you can see it's got some debris. So there's different mechanical ways to clean up the site, whether it's with a machine, it may have a Harley rake or a rock hound or some of those type things. The most common way we end up doing the final preparation is raking and trying to clean all the rocks and the gravel out as much as possible. So now that we have a site relatively prepared, I'm just going to do a small example of installing the sod, just some real basics. Before I do that, I'm going to show you a couple things tools you may have on your site. Of course, a rake. There'll be a spade. Perhaps you have razor knives or machetes. The spade is used to chop the sod at angles and around corners and those types of things. I'll show that in a moment. You'll have a spreader like this to spread your materials, whether it be fertilizer, lime, even seed. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those components as we go. And then for the seeding portion, you'll have typically pine needles as a mulch. We'll talk more about that on the seeding portion. So once you've prepped your site with the rake and it's ready for seed or sod, before you proceed with either of those, that's the time you want to put down your fertilizer or your lime applications. Your fertilizer could be something like this bag here, which is Milorganite, which we commonly use. It could be a variety of products. The basics, without getting into too much detail, basic thing you need to understand is that there are very specific rates for each of these products. It could be 10 pounds per thousand. It could be 5 pounds per thousand. That's true with seed, fertilizer, lime, all of those things. Anything we're putting down. It's also true with chemicals, which was probably touched on in another portion. But just understand your rate that you need to apply. So these spreaders have very specific settings that correlate to putting down X amount per thousand. We have some paperwork that we can provide you with to help you dial that in. Of course, your supervisor can help you dial that in, but just having a realization that those products go down at a very specific rate, and you want to put those down before you install your sod and or seed. So for demonstration purposes, we're going to say that the area I'm standing in is where the sod's going to go. And outside the lines is a concrete surface. We're just going to pretend that for a moment. So I've got a corner here that I need to start with. So you take your sod, you get down, line it up with your lines. A lot of this work is going to be on the ground. You'll be on your knees a lot. So you take the sod, you get it nice and tied up to your edge. Make sure it's nice and flat. Everything looks good, and you're ready for another piece. So you just have to grab the sod, pull it up nice and tight. Pay close attention to your seams, that things fit nice and tight. You got nice straight lines. Again, this is concrete, so we're going right down the concrete. So that piece is now in place. One key component as you start your second row in this situation, you see the pieces are uniform in size. In order for all of your seams not to line up together, you want to stagger the sod installation. Think of it like a brick pattern on a house, how the bricks are staggered and offset. So you just lay your first piece over, you roll it out about halfway. Then you take your spade and cut your line. Then when you come back with your next full piece, your seam will be in the middle of this piece of sod, so your seams will not be all lined up together. This is extremely important on a slope where water will come downhill. It will tend to catch those seams if they're all lined up, create ruts and those types of things. Even on flat ground, we always alternate like this, but as I said, it's especially important on slopes. One thing about sod, of course, it's a perishable product. In other words, it's been harvested before it came to your job, preferably the same day. So obviously the one thing it's going to need as soon as you possibly can is to get some water. So how much water? You'll get that question possibly from the homeowner. We want to say about an inch a week. It's what's needed, an inch to an inch and a half a week. Of course it varies on rainfall and if the site's irrigated. There's all these components that go into it. But for the purposes of the day of installation, you don't need to leave the job site until every square inch of the sod has been watered in thoroughly. Whether that's through a sprinkler, through a hose, by hand, whatever it takes to get the sod watered. So for seeding applications, you've prepped the area, you've raked it, you've removed all the debris, you've applied your lime per the recommended rate, fertilizer and seed per the recommended rate. One of the last things we'll do is apply a mulch material to help retain moisture in the soil. Typically, that will be pine needles. The same material we might use in beds as mulch, we use as a mulch on top of seed. So what you want to do is take the bale apart, pull out, once you've got it cut apart, pull out the pine needles, and you're just going to shake them over the area. You want to get a nice uniform coating of the mulch material. You don't want it to be too thick, big piles. You want it to be uniform and just enough to cover the soil. Windy day like today, you may have an issue. You got to stay low to the ground, spread it low to the ground. If you've got your water close by, it's a good idea to water it in as you go. It'll also weight it down, make it stick to the ground better. But you want to just have a nice uniform layer of material. You always want to pick up your strings off the bale. You don't leave the strings behind, and just be sure that you get it nice and uniform. So to follow up with some final notes on the sod installation, understanding it's a perishable product, it arrives to your site, you want to be prepared, have the ground ready, have everything down so that you can begin installation immediately. Use your straight lines, figure out your longest straight line, start laying it that way. Stagger, remember the staggering point. Rolling it in with a roller at the end. You should have a roller on your site. Really makes it get good contact with the ground. And then lastly, the water. The water is key to making it be successful.
Hi, I'm Michael Davey. I'm the arborist with the Natural Resources Department here, and we're going to talk a little bit about pruning today. It's just kind of covering some basic stuff. Most of you, most of the time, will not be needing to do more than some very basic and minimal pruning. If it gets more involved, you'll probably need to get somebody in the gardening department or somebody in my department to deal with it. Some of you may be gardeners though, so hopefully this will be helpful. So something to talk about first is safety, because when you're pruning, you're working with sharp tools, and you need to make sure you're wearing gloves, especially just with the little things like this. Most of you will just be using a pair of hand pruners and maybe a handsaw like this, a folding handsaw. They are very sharp, obviously. Besides just wearing gloves, is just the use you need to be very careful of. If you're cutting in wind like there is today, it's very easy to have sawdust blow into your eyes, so you need to make sure you're wearing safety glasses at all the times when you're pruning. If you're using these hand pruners, you have to make sure you keep your fingers away. It's very easy to be trying to hold something and snipping, and you can cut yourself pretty quickly with these. Something else that's important to do is to keep your tools well kept and sharp. Usually you'll be provided with at least a small tool for sharpening the blades on these. These saws are really not sharpenable. They are, but it's nearly impossible. So usually after a point when they're not really cutting well, you will just get another one. You can replace these blades. After the handles wear out, you just replace the whole saw. They're not too expensive, but it's much better to be using tools that are sharp and are going to function well for you when you're out there, rather than being frustrated trying to chew through something with dull tools. So when you're doing a pruning cut, and this will be in the handout in your notebook, there's every branch, not every branch, but most branches will have a little collar, this little swollen area around the top of it. A lot of times they'll have this kind of corky ridge where the tissue folds in. This collar is where the branch tissue and the trunk tissue kind of combine together. So when you're doing a pruning cut, you want to make sure you stay outside of this line, because that is where you don't want to cut into the trunk tissue. It heals better, it'll heal faster, it's just better for the tree. Sometimes it's not as obvious as this. You can see a collar up on here. This tree is particularly good at forming these branch bark ridges, but they're not always as visible. We'll look at a couple other things over there, and in certain types of forks, they're a little bit more difficult to see. But in general, if you're going to be cutting a branch on the trunk, or even out there, even the secondary branches and tertiary branches will still have usually some kind of collar or some kind of ridge. Something else it's important to know what species you're pruning, at least to kind of know how the growth habit is, the size of the tree ultimately. A lot of times it's just going to be a matter of looking at the structure of the tree, and like this is a black gum, for example. Black gums tend to have a lot of very dense branching, especially as young trees. They're very close together. This gets to be a large tree, and ultimately these branches are going to be far too close together. So they'll need to be thinned. So it may just be an initial pruning. If it's just been installed, you may just do a little bit of cleanup. There may just be some broken limbs. A lot of times for the landscapers who are just fixing up something after installation, you may be just looking for broken limbs, little small stubby limbs, and that's about it, other than you may see an egregious limb that's crossing into another limb that just looks bad, and you can just clip that out. It'll look better, give a better product. So knowing what you're pruning is fairly important. A small growing tree is going to be, it's very different choices in your pruning. So like ultimately, if this gets to be a large tree, none of these limbs in here are going to be permanent limbs. They'll all slowly get phased out as the tree gets to be a bigger tree and branches up higher. So it may be that some of these limbs here are ultimately going to be the permanent lowest limb, or even higher, depending on where it is in the landscape. So you don't take them all off at first. They use these limbs to produce food. They use them to help increase the girth on the trunk as they grow. So you're just making some choices now to help it through the short-term period. So maybe you'll go in here, and where you have 1, 2, 3 limbs are very close together. These two are right on top of each other, so we'll take out this little one below. We need to cut outside on that branch collar. And you can see that this limb right here has a fairly distinct branch collar, and there's that little ridge in the top. And you always make sure and cut outside of that little corky ridge right in the fork. It's a little more difficult in a branch like this. This branch right here has what's called a bark inclusion, and it's because of the narrow fork. When this gets to be a larger tree, these kind of forks are weaker inherently because the bark cannot fuse between the narrowness of that. As they grow and expand into each other, the bark wedges inside, and proportionally as it gets bigger, it becomes weaker. Now again, this limb may only be temporary for a few years, and that may be more relevant it's going to be more relevant in a tree that gets to be a bigger tree than in a small ornamental tree, and it's more relevant in the limbs that are definitely going to stay on there as a permanent part of the structure. So, a lot of times you would want to eliminate that. This we'll probably leave now because the tree is it's using these limbs as temporary limbs, and you can consider a lot of these limbs temporary on younger trees. Okay, so here, this is a red maple. Red maples get to be a larger tree, and in general, any larger tree, unless it was specced out and planted as a clump, which some larger trees are, like most often river birch, why I don't know, but larger trees they're going to grow much better with a single trunk and a central leader, which is the main trunk. You want to keep the main trunk going up as straight and central as possible. This tree is very confused. This came from the nursery like this, and really it's kind of junk, but sometimes you can repair these. Like, you would want to eliminate all but one trunk on this. Now, so hopefully nothing like this would ever go out on a job, but you may be faced with this and you're supposed to fix it in coming into it later. But that's very different than the tree behind me. This is a serviceberry, and that is a generally much smaller growing tree, and they're very often planted as a clump. There's like witch hazels, there's a number of different species. So it's always important, again, to know what species you're pruning, what the ultimate form and with the space that it's supposed to be in. So knowing those things are always relevant before you do any pruning at all. This is a larger growing tree right here. This is a group of bald cypress. We picked this because there's some good illustrations in here. These get to be larger trees. They're conifers, and it's even more important a lot of times for these to have a single straight trunk. So this tree, you can see it goes up, and it does have it's called a codominant stem. It's really basically like double trunk. The trunk goes up and splits into two. And so as these both get to be bigger, if you left that alone, they're going to both grow into each other. That's going to become one of those included forks, one of those poor forks. It'll be weak. And so right now, while this is a small tree, this is a super easy cut to make, and then you're just eliminating a problem down the road. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that right now because I'm right here. Get rid of these. I'm sorry. And just pull that out, and that's a simple, it takes a second now, and it prevents problems for years down the road. That's the benefit of pruning. You're preventing problems that can become much bigger problems down the road. And aesthetically, it looks better. It's better for the health if you can go minimally. It's going to be long-term better for the health of the tree to eliminate these problems so they don't lose pieces later on down the road. So for most larger growing species, like I said, it is going to be better for them to have a strong central trunk, and this is ideal. Every tree is different, and the conditions they're growing in are different. The conditions in the nursery they were growing in is different. They have different forms. Some trees are meant to be very narrow forked and narrow crowned, even as larger trees. There's Fastigiate carpinus is one of them, and they're supposed to be a little column. They fit into narrow spaces. So when you're working with those, you need to be aware that that's what they're supposed to be like. Some trees are meant to be very open, some are even very sprawly and down low. There's some Maryland spreader hollies. It's a particular holly that just is like a little sprawling bush along the ground. So you wouldn't prune that like one of the hollies behind me, they get to be tree form. So again, for a larger growing tree, as an idealized thing, one strong trunk going vertically with branches well spaced around it is the ideal. And so some trees tend to grow like that much easier. Like there's a sycamore here, it grows as a young tree. They tend to really want to go straight and blast up. They usually have one trunk. There's some other species around that are much more prone to having suckers, which is a sprout that comes off from the base of the tree. Usually you're going to want to get rid of those. But again, if it's a multi-branched shrub, that's what it's supposed to be like. So just know what you're pruning. If you don't know it, you can talk to your supervisor and they should be able to help you out. If your tools are dull, you talk to your supervisor and hopefully they can get you set up. So, and if it's something more than you feel like you can deal with, don't do it. Talk to your supervisor. You can get us, they can get the gardeners, and we'll help you out. So sometimes you may need to cut a bigger limb that's maybe more horizontal and it's a little bit heavy. If you cut it sometimes in just one cut close to the trunk, as you cut, the weight of it will start to open up the cut and it'll pull down and it'll tear down. So you don't want to cut a big limb in just one cut. You'll do what's called a 3-point cut. This limb is a little bit, it's not really that big, but we're going to go ahead and just do it to illustrate it. So what you do is you do your first cut some distance out from the base of the trunk where you're going to cut it, and you'll do your first cut on the underside, and then you'll do your second cut past that on the top side of it. So as you cut, it'll end up breaking off down the fibers and it doesn't peel down. So you get that out of the way and then you'll finish your cut back close to the trunk. And again, you noticed I cut outside of that branch bark ridge and I cut it a little bit perpendicular to the growth of the limb. So like it wasn't cut flush against the trunk. You cut it a little bit at this angle outward. So it's still part of the branch tissue and it'll heal. It's a smaller wound that'll close it a little faster. So with handsaw cuts, you can cut bigger things. These hand pruners are useful for smaller limbs, but sometimes you need to cut something a little bit big. You don't want to try and just cut something gigantic with these. It's just a waste of time. You're going to gum through it. But if you're cutting something that's a little bit larger, there's a little trick to it. You can basically, as you cut, this is the cutting part. This is the blade, and this is called the anvil. The blade the branch pushes against the anvil. The blade does most of the cutting. So it's going to open up from the blade side. So sometimes you can actually, as you're squeezing with your hand, you can push the branch a little bit and it opens up that cut easier, and it makes it easier to cut slightly larger branches so it doesn't wear you out too much. So this is a bit of a large cut. So just to recap, when you're pruning, again, if you're uncomfortable doing it, then don't do it. If you can do some of these minimal cuts generally without any issue, if you cut them correctly. Know what you're cutting, try and know where to cut, and make sure your tools are sharp and keep them maintained. If you feel like you're getting over your head, talk to me, the gardeners, talk to your supervisor first, and we'll help you out. You don't get anything over your head. So just try and enjoy yourself, and welcome to the team. Okay, this is Michael, the arborist with Natural Resources again, and I'm just going to go over a few rudimentary things about small engine use. For a lot of people, this will be super rudimentary. You'll know this stuff, and it's not going to teach you anything. But there's always some people that really need to learn this stuff. So hopefully, it'll be useful at least to some of you. I'm going to go through just a few of the different machines and a few of the different types of engines, and then I'll go through a little bit more specifically about chainsaws and chainsaw use, just because those have more potential for injury. So with any of these we use a lot of different machines here at Snow Creek, all kinds of different things. And if you don't, so the first thing I should say, if you don't know how to use it, get some instruction on it. Some of them are easier to use. Some of them are very simple. There's lawnmowers, there's weed eaters, but there's also whacker packers, there's water pumps. They all have their specificities. If you're unfamiliar with it, you talk to your supervisor, we'll get you some help and we'll work it out. It's okay to not know. You're not going to know everything. There's all kinds of different things. So, but one thing that's very important to know for any of these that you're using is that with small engines, there's basically two different kinds. There's the two-stroke engines, and which is like chainsaws, weed eaters, and blowers, and those engines take gas that has oil mixed into it because that's how they lubricate the engine. So these smaller cans that we keep on the trucks, these have mixed gas in them. The larger cans, the 5-gallon cans, those have straight gas. And so any of the, if you don't know for sure, find out. One easy way to tell is if there is an oil cap with a dipstick or on the engine. If there's an oil cap, then that means that it takes straight gas and it has the oil to lubricate the engine. It's a separate oil and gas system. And the other ones, it is mixed. So the one, I guess, exemption to that is chainsaws, which do have a separate oil cap that has nothing to do with the running of the engine. It all has to do with lubricating the chain as it runs around the bar. So if you don't have oil in there, that bar will get really hot, the chain will start to bind, and it just won't work well. So, but that again, that's a separate kind of oil, and that's just, you'll have to refill that as you use them. Whereas in most engines, it's closed off and the oil stays in there. It just pumps through and keeps the engine lubricated. So if you don't know, always make sure every year at some point, there'll be somebody who will put straight gas into a blower or weed eater, and immediately you'll ruin it. It'll kill it. It's like something else to know is we do have a few motors that are diesel. Some of there's a mini skid steer, which is a small track machine, and that runs on diesel. The yellow cans, which are larger and they're yellow, those have diesel. So again, if you don't know, just find out. So with every machine, you have to start it up, and hopefully you've got the proper gas in there, and it should be an operating machine. If it's not operating, then you'll need to find the repair tags. There's repair tags that are in the office, the field office. There's some in the shop. So if you have a machine that's not operating of any kind, you find one of these repair tags, you write down what the problem is as best you can tell. It won't start, or it's running poorly, or whatever. And you tie it on there somewhere obvious, and you put it either in the shop if it's open, or you can set it in front of the shop, in front of the door in the afternoons, and Carnell will put it into the shop to get fixed. So again, like I said, if you've got the right thing, though, then you're going to be ready to start it, hopefully. So there's different ways for different things. I'm just going to go over a few of the basic things. Again, there's so many different things, I can't get into everything. But so most of them will have an on-off switch. On the blowers, it's down there on the trigger handle. On the chainsaws, they have it back on the back handle. And on the weed eaters, it's out on, it's on here. This is of course worn off, but you can see on the orange it says stop. Most every machine somewhere will have some kind of stop switch. All Honda engines, we have a lot of Honda engines, that's why I chose a Honda engine. They all have, it's usually a red, and it says it's an on-off switch on there, okay? So if it's off, it's not gonna run, it won't ignite, it won't have the ignition running. So a lot of these 2-cycle engines will have what's called a primer bulb. When the engine's cold, all the fuel will just drain down into the tank. This primer bulb, you just push it like about 3 times. If you push it more times, it doesn't matter. It just cycles it back through, but it fills the carburetor back up. So it's kind of ready to go. And most of them will also have a choke. And what that does is it increases the fuel mix So there's more gas going into it initially and not as much air. So it's because a cold engine, it makes it easier to start. So normally you'll put it into the choke position. You make sure it's turned on if this is cold. You put it in the on position, you put it in choke, you can do the primer bulb, and then you'll pull it to start. Usually it'll start up and kind of rev up a little bit because of the choke, and then just let it run for just a few seconds, and then you can turn the choke off. You may have to do that a couple times, but usually just once will get it going. Some of these other machines will have a choke. This has a choke lever, and it also has a fuel lever. This turns the fuel on and off. So a lot of the 4-cycle engines, the ones that take oil, a lot of them do have a fuel line, and they'll have somewhere in the line a way to turn the gas on and off. So if it's not running, a lot of times you'll have to find, sometimes it's a valve, sometimes it's like this, sometimes it's just a butterfly valve. But you'll have to look for it. Again, there's so many different engines. So after you get it started and running, again, make sure you have all of your proper PPE for running anything. You need, for a blower, you'll need your hearing protection. For running most of these engines, you'll need hearing protection. A lot of times you'll need eye protection, especially if you're using weed eaters. I'll go through the stuff for chainsaws later. But so you operate it, and hopefully it's running well. Again, if it's not running well, you put a repair tag on it and turn it in. I will go through just a couple troubleshooting things. You guys are not mechanics. We have a mechanic here to fix things, and you don't want to spend a bunch of time out in the field trying to fix something if it's not working. Talk to your supervisor. We'll have to try and take care of it as best as we can, as quick as we can, and not have you trying to do a bunch of repairs in the field. But there are some simple things you can do if your machinery is not running well. So all these engines, they need fuel, they need spark, and they need air in order to run. So they need oil too. Again, the 2-cycle engines have the oil mixed into the gas, so when you fill them up, they have their lubrication. So it's always good to check the oil on the other engines. They'll have a dipstick somewhere on them. You can just open it up and check and make sure it has enough oil in it. It's good to check it when it's cold and the oil is drained down to the bottom, and it should be fairly level when you check it. So you have oil, you have fuel. If you know you have gas in there, then it should run. If it's not running well, then the other things you can check, if it doesn't have air, that could be from the air filters. And so on all these engines will have air filters. I'm not going to go into all of them, but a lot of times you can just take the cap off and look at it, and sometimes it'll be clogged up. Sometimes they'll get, if you leave the choke on too long, or if it rides in a bad position, you'll get too much fuel into the carburetor, and it's called flooding. A lot of times you can just let it rest for a while if it's flooded, and it'll start again in a few minutes. You can also, on some of these, especially the steels, we use a lot of steel 2-cycle engines. A lot of those you can actually turn the on-off switch into the off position and pull the starter cord about 5 times, and that actually tends to clear out the carbs. So then you just turn the switch back on, not into choke, but just turn it back on and pull it a few times, and very often it will start back up. Let's see. If you have as long as you have fuel in there, there's not going to be too many opportunities for you don't want to try and change a fuel filter or find a fuel line filter. It's usually going to be, if it's just sparking but it's not running, it's possible that the gas switch is in the off position, so just make sure that that's in the on position. And if it's not sparking, the spark plugs in these things can get dirty sometimes, or if you flood the engine, or if it's not running great. And sometimes you can, if you have the tools on the chainsaws, they have a tool like this you can use to pull this big side to pull the spark plug on them. And you can sometimes just look at the spark plug. The spark plug, it should have a gap between the electrode and the terminal, so that's the spark goes between there. If the electrode's very rounded, it may not spark well, and it may need to be replaced. If it's very dirty, like gummy, or if it's closed up with oil or other material, then you can sometimes clean that out and put it back in and it'll run again. But again, there's only so much you can do in the field. So if you just can't get it to run again, talk to your supervisor, we'll try and get it worked out. So chainsaws are great tools, but they're very dangerous. So again, if you have not used a chainsaw before, this video is not going to teach you how to use a chainsaw. If you don't know how to use a chainsaw and somebody hands you one and says, here, go cut something, tell them you don't know how to use a chainsaw, okay? We can give you lessons if you need to. I can give lessons. There's other people here who can give you lessons on how to use a chainsaw safely. But this is hopefully just some brush up and a little bit of detailed information for some people who have used a chainsaw before. Maybe you don't know some of this stuff, or maybe you're not used to using them as much as some of us are. So again, if you can't use it, just don't, and that's fine. You don't have to. But if you do use it, you need to make sure you definitely need to make sure you have all the PPE. It's just, as with any of these tools you're using, make sure you have all the PPE. It's super important. It's no good if you hurt yourself. You don't need to hurt yourself for this. You don't want to lose your hearing and not be able to hear music because you haven't been using hearing protection. You don't want to whack yourself in the leg or hit yourself in the eye with the pieces flying off of a weed eater. Just use the stuff. It's better for everybody in the long run, okay? So with a chainsaw, you have to have hearing protection. You need to have a pair of gloves because sometimes you'll have to move the chain around, and it's just, you have to have gloves. You need to have some boots. Chaps, like I said, are required. It's OSHA required, and it's going to make you feel more comfortable using it. When you get the saws, your supervisor should give you a pair of chaps with it, and hopefully they will have an extra chain to give you in case you run into trouble. Again, like I said, you need hearing protection. If you're actually going to be felling a tree or dropping anything that's overhead, then you need to have a hard hat also. So something to understand about chainsaws, and this is some basic stuff, but the chain runs always in this direction. It moves away from you on top, it goes around the tip, and it comes back towards you on the bottom. So when you're cutting, you know, you're throttling it back here, and so when you go, if you're cutting from the top, there's different ways of cutting, but if you're cutting from the top, when these teeth are moving like this, it's going to kind of pull the saw into it. So you just need to be prepared for that motion. But and occasionally you will need to cut something from underneath because of the way wood can be weighted and tensioned. So because every piece of wood you're cutting potentially will have some kind of tension on it. Even if you have a short log that's laying on the ground but maybe has a little bit of curve in it, like if it's arched a little bit, it's kind of like a bridge. If you start cutting down from the top, as you cut down, when you get down towards the bottom, that little opening on the top will kind of start to close in as the bridge kind of starts to collapse, and so it'll start pinching the bar. So you need to try and look at everything you're cutting and at least think about those tensions. But the most important thing, though, to remember about as the chain moves around is that the tip is the most dangerous part, and it's the part that you need to keep clear from anything else, because that's what causes kickback. If you've heard of kickback in chainsaws, it's the chain runs around, and that tip, if you hit the tip against something, the forces are going directly upward. So if you undercut something, it's going to kind of push back towards you. If you cut from the top, it pulls the saw into it. But if you hit something on the tip, it makes that fly up, okay? So that's what causes kickback, and that's very dangerous because then you have a running saw flying right towards you. So whenever you're cutting something, you have to totally be aware of what's on the other side if you can't see it, if it's a big log, or just don't ever start a cut going in on the tip. So if you're cutting something that's too big for the bar, like maybe you're using the small saw and you have to be cutting something big, at the tip of the bar, if you can't see it in there, then you probably need to stop because it's going to get kickback. Sometimes people even who've used saws before kind of don't understand, why is that saw bouncing up so much as the bar goes into it, and that's because that tip is flinging it up. So all these chainsaws have what's known as an inertia brake. It's a chain brake. It's this lever on the front. It's there to protect your hand, but it's also there to activate this chain brake. So all the saws will have it, and you should use them all the time. If the saw is running and if you're not cutting, just activate that chain brake. Usually if you're holding it, you can just kind of bump your wrist into it like that. But if the saw does have a kickback action, this is meant to function as an inertia brake. So when it flings up, the inertia of it is supposed to activate that. But you can't count on that. And something else that's good to remember if you're operating a chainsaw is it's always good, because of that potential for that kickback, to run the saw as you're cutting standing a little bit to the side. If you're standing over it like this and it was to kick back, and a lot of times people will do that, it can kick back into you, and that's a common place for injuries to occur. So if you stand a little bit to the side, it did happen to kick back, it's going to be more likely to come over beside you like that. Because even if the chain brake does activate, it can still have a lot of force and be flinging towards you. So again, always use a chain brake, and if you're moving around on site, just use that all the time. Get used to using it. It doesn't hurt it to use it. It's a great thing to do. It's super simple. So I can't get into all the different things about felling and so much about tensions and cutting. So I mainly want to cover just keeping that tip clear, and then also making sure that the saw is sharp when you get it, because if you're cutting with a dull saw, it's going to be very frustrating. It's very easy to dull these saws. If you're running it and it happens to go into the dirt, it's going to dull it quickly. If you hit a rock, if you hit anything, steel, a nail, whatever, it'll dull it immediately, because this thing is flinging around so fast, it'll dull it very quickly. But a lot of people don't think that dirt is going to hurt it, because dirt seems soft, but it will really it almost immediately dull a chain. It's hard to tell sometimes if you look at a chain. There's the angle on the top and the point, and it's very hard to tell when they're dull, but a lot of times if you look very closely, you can look and see just a little bit of rounding over of that point, or possibly along that top plate, you may see a little bit of like just a beveled angle on there, and that means that it ran into something and it dulled it. So it's hard to tell, but if you're cutting and it's just not working, it's a good chance it's dull. So hopefully you can change out the chain, and that's something I'll go over here in just a minute. So whenever you get a saw to use, make sure that the chain brake is functional. It always has to click like this, and you can do it, and you can try and move the chain and it won't move. Never try to move a chain by hand by pulling it this direction, because if your hand catches and slides, you're going to go right on the sharp teeth. Push it away from you on the top, or you can pull it this way on the bottom, and that way you're going against the dull side. But make sure that chain brake is functional, and make sure that this saw, I pulled it out because it's missing. This saw has, this is a plastic one on this. This is just the type. This is a sacrificial piece, really. If the chain is running and it's running loose at all, and it can pop off of the bar. And if it pops off, then what happens, because of the way it's moving, it's going to be pulled in this way, it's going to swing underneath, and this piece just catches that chain, and that's what that's for. It's a sacrificial piece, so it just stops it and stops the chain. The chain will fling back a little bit. That's why chainsaws have these big bottom plates like this. If the chain slings back, it's going to catch against this. And it should have a hook right here. So this saw can't be used right now because it doesn't have the chain catch. So make sure that that's on there. Make sure that these bar nuts are tight, and make sure the chain is the correct tension. And I'll show you that in just a second when we change this chain, just as a demonstration. So, yeah. Now, like I said before, these saws, like all two-stroke engines, they take mixed gas, and but they do have an oil cap. This oil cap has nothing to do with the operation of the engine. It has all to do with lubricating this chain as it runs through there, because if it didn't have oil running into it all the time, it just will get hot, it binds up, and it'll stop functioning. So if you happen to be running it and you notice that it's like it's not running well, but the engine sounds like it's good, it's very possible that either that it's dull or that you've run out of oil. So this oil, this is not like an oil cap on a 4-stroke engine that really loses oil very slowly. This runs out oil as you run the engine. So for every tank of gas, you'll use close to a tank of the oil. So you make sure whenever you fuel it up, you always check the oil. So you'll see on the standard work that's in your notebook, you'll have the list of the protective equipment you need. It does go through a few of the basics for running a saw, but again, this is not teaching you guys how to run a chainsaw, but just some of the other things to look for. You should have, hopefully, like I said, a spare chain with you, and you should have a scrunch. This is called a scrunch. It's a chainsaw. It's a screwdriver wrench, scrunch. And again, if it's dull, if the saw's not running well, or even if it's dull, then you get one of these repair tags and you can tag it, and you can just say that the chain is dull if you don't have a spare chain, just so that whoever gets it at the end of the day, they can get it fixed rather than have it go out the next day on the job and somebody is very frustrated because it's not working. So I'm going to go into changing the chain, and the first thing you do is you have to loosen these bar nuts on here. Make sure that the chain brake is off, because you actually need to move this around a little bit. And this particular one has these bar nuts actually stick on there. A lot of times they come free, so make sure you keep track of those and don't lose them. So the chain is tensioned on the bar. There's a little pin right here. You see there's these holes. If you can see that, there's holes on each side of the bar, and the holes are matched and mirrored on each side because you can use either side of the bar. This says steel upside up. It can be upside down. You can flip the bar. That's a good thing to do occasionally to make the bar wear more evenly. So these bigger holes are for this pin, and that's what adjusts the bar in and out to tension this chain. So when you first take this off, you'll kind of raise it off of that pin so you can move it back. And then you can get this chain off of the sprocket back here, okay? You take the chain off of the sprocket, and then you can move the whole thing off, and you take the chain off, the old chain off. And so you make sure so when you're ready to put the other one back on, this little slot right there, that's where the oil pump pumps oil into another hole on this bar. There's another smaller hole right here. You need to make sure that is clear, because that is where this oil goes into this groove and lubricates the chain as it runs around. So every time you change a chain, you take the bar off, make sure you're wearing gloves, because these can have little burrs that can cut your hand. You're having to deal with the chain, which is very sharp, especially the new one. So make sure that these holes are open, because if they're clogged up, you'll put it back on and it will not be able to oil correctly. So again, we'll put it on upside down just for the fun of it. So you have your new chain. Again, remember the direction that the chain moves. It runs away from you on the top and it runs towards you on the bottom. So when you put the new chain on, first you put it over this nose sprocket, and you'll see how it rests into this little star sprocket on the nose, and you rest the runners into there, and you start getting it onto the grooves of the bar. You run these runners into there. See, now this is where you have to have gloves, because there's no way around really having to hold on to the chain. So you get this back here, and you make sure that these runners are set into, all the saws have some kind of sprocket. They're slightly different, but they all have these. This has a slot that the runners run into. Some of the other saws actually it's like a star-shaped spoke that you just put the runners around. But on these, you need to make sure that these little runners on the back of the chain, they go into the sprocket, okay? So again, I'm going to put this back onto the bar grooves. Make sure it's in the sprocket. There we go. Okay, and so most of the time when you put a new chain on, you will have to loosen this screw in the center, which slides that pin back and forth. So you'll loosen it some, and it makes it easier for that pin to set on there. So when it's set on there, it'll actually kind of hold itself like that. You need to make sure it stays on that pin. If you put the bar on and you don't have that pin in that hole, and you tighten these down, it'll just bend that pin and you won't be able to tension the bar anymore. So you put these on hand tight. Again, it's going in the correct direction. It's set in here. And you're going to adjust the tension on this chain. So this chain right now, it's a little bit loose, okay? You see how it kind of flops around there? If you run it like this, it's more likely for that chain to pop out of there. It'll come off and it can fling back, okay? So you don't want it super tight on there either because it needs to be able to run freely. So again, it's kind of hand tight. So it's the bar's about in the position. It's not too floppy there. And then you just tension it up with this screw. A little bit tighter. So it's tight enough there I can pull it out, but it's pretty snug on there, and I can still run it freely by hand. Again, always in this direction. I'm gonna go slightly tighter. And when you have it the right tension, then you just tighten up these bar nuts fully. And when you tighten up the bar nuts, make sure they're tight, but you don't have to don't get ridiculously, heavy on them because it'll be very hard to get them off. As long as they're tight, they don't really creep out. Make sure they're tight for sure. I can't really say how many foot-pounds of torque. It may be in the manual, but get it good and tight, but don't kill yourself doing it. And so again, chain brake's free. You can run it free by hand, but it doesn't really pull out of there. That's about the right tension. So that's how you change a chain. There's a few variations in the different models, but they're all about the same. One thing I did want to mention on this, you'll notice that some of these saws, some of the larger saws will have a little button up here, and all that is it reduces the compression in the engine when you're starting it. So when you first start it and you put it on the choke, and on these saws you pull the trigger down and push it all the way down to put it into choke. But you can push that button, and when you pull it, it's a little bit easier to start it. Something else that's very important to go over is the starting procedure for a saw, because you can't, I'm sure you've seen people just hold a saw and grab it and then drop it. It's called a drop start, just the old drop start. That's actually illegal. You can't do that. You can put the saw, the ideal thing to do is to put the saw on the ground and to put your foot in the back handle like this. So the saw is on the ground in a stable position. You put your foot into the back handle like this. And this is on choke. You can do the compression. The chain brake has to be on. So you have it firmly on the ground, you put your hand down here, and then you're ready to pull start it. And then what happens is, as soon as the ignition fires, this will actually pop out. Sometimes it pops out before the thing is started. So you may just push it in again and then, run it again, pull it again. It'll just make it easier to start. So you can put it on an elevated surface as long as it's below your waist level. Maybe you have a low log or something. It needs to be stable though. The best way is to put it on the ground like that to start it. These smaller saws, it's a little bit harder because they don't have a back handle to step into, but usually you can engage the chain brake. You can put it on the ground or on an elevated surface and hold it like this while you pull pull the pull handle with your other hand. But that is very relevant, and that's an OSHA requirement, is to have it on the ground, or to there's a way that you can put it between your legs and pull it, and that's actually it's a little bit controversial. I would recommend against that. Sometimes the pull cord will grab and you'll just yank it between your legs, and that's very uncomfortable. So it's best to do it on the ground, trust me. And that's about it. Again, if you don't know how to use a saw, don't use it. If you're uncomfortable using a saw, that's fine. You just tell your supervisor you don't have to do it. They're dangerous things. You need to feel relatively comfortable when you're using them. So again, try to have a chain with you when you go out. You should always have a chainsaw tool, the scrunch. You need to have your chaps, your eye protection, your hearing protection, and if you're felling, you need to have your hard hat. And just get with me or with somebody else if you ever need any help with it.